Hello, everybody. Welcome to the One Question Podcast, the podcast that brings together two Christians and a skeptic in conversation about the state of the world and what justice looks like in practice. Each episode returns to one core question: how do we move from words to action in ways that actually strengthen community? We unpack what's happening, name the forces behind it, and stay focused on what people can build together. My name is Matthew Brake, and I'm your host. And with me are my co-hosts, Jason Bayless.
Hi.
And Moki Masao.
What's up?
Fellas, what is going on?
Summer break, man.
It's all one question.
Yeah, it's just going to be an entire podcast of us going, hey, what's up with you? Not much. What's going on? You know how it is. What's going on with you? And then they'll just go in a circle. Yeah, no, it's good. Summer is good. Is staying cool here on the East Coast. The algae in the reflecting pool is in bloom. The blue paint is peeling and floating to the surface, as it does this time of year.
What a time to be alive, man.
What a time to be alive. Well, fellas, last time we spent the past two episodes chatting a bit about, largely looking, me and Moki sort of shared some of our past histories of where our own Christian lives have taken us. And, we had thrown out to Jason, okay, it's story time. And he was like, I don't really want to share my story. That's not my role here. But we kind of got him to share part of his story by talking to him about Radical Guide and what the work is there and how that came about and how one engages in the work of mutual aid and those types of things. We spent the last two episodes talking about a Radical Guide. So if you're listening to this episode, go back and listen to our last two, because Jason kind of gave us a download on a lot of the work he's involved in, a lot of the ways he approaches that work, thinks about that work in terms of what it means to engage in mutual aid with others. Now, one of the conversations that sort of came out, I think when we were offline with each other, when we were talking about what we'll talk about next, at one point in the last episode, we were talking about doing either charity work or mutual aid work, all these different types of work to help others, which we also talked about the problem of helping others from this position of power and how that can be problematic. But a question that came up was sort of okay, when you're engaging in acts of mutual aid of some sort, how do you scale that work up, right? Because it's hard not to think about, okay, I'm helping maybe 10 people now. Wouldn't it be great if I could help 100 or 1,000? And we talked about some of the problems with that scaling up mentality. And I think, Moki, you and I could probably relate some of that to, in a lot of the churches and church environments you and I were in, so much of it focused on scaling up, right? You don't just have a church of 50 people. You want a church of 100 people, and then 200 people, and then 300 people. Or, maybe you only want a church to grow to a certain size, but then you want a lot of little churches, so you scale up a network or something like that. Mm-hmm. And so that idea of scaling up is something that sort of in the evangelical spaces I was raised in, there was always this focus on growth and scale, needing to reach more people. And I think we sort of talked about the ways that scaling up sort of plays into sort of certain capitalist logics of, I would imagine things like domination or growth or expansionism, colonialism, all those things. Jason, as you see it, what are some of the problems, just to quickly rehash, of thinking about things in terms of scaling up? In terms of I
think the thought of scaling up is a byproduct of how you approach the problem. So going back to what we said last episode, and just to pull out the language that you used on this one, it's around the belief that you're here to help somebody. And then the idea that if I continue to help more people, we can help more and more people. So therefore, it automatically forces you in the framing of how do I scale this? Because if you approach it differently, then realize that you're not the core value of the work is not to help people. That's not the coming from. But it's a realization that there are systems and structures that exist in this world that put all of us in different levels of oppression, poverty, whatever it may be. Then there's a different framing of it. It's we're not here to help each other. We're actually here to build something different, and that requires a relationship. And then so scaling doesn't become the natural next step or the next question. The question then becomes is like, then what conversations are we having and what are we building to actually remove ourselves from these systems of institutions, these systems of oppression, so that we are no longer impacted negatively because of the way the capitalist system model is set up. We're no longer feeding into that model. And when we talked about episode 3, maybe it was talking about the charity model being a part of the capitalist system, is because the charity exists because there's a flaw within the system, and the system calculates that flaw as part of the equation. So when you do charity work, it's actually helping the oppressive system maintain and continue. And so not thinking about stepping into it to help people, but shifting it of like, how do we work together, conversation, and build community and relationships that actually remove us from that system is a completely different baseline that doesn't require or involve scaling. So it's like,
it seems like you'd be saying that scaling, I mean, has a few problems. One, that's scaling up in order to help people. One, you're creating hierarchy because I'm here to help you. In creating scaling, you also inherently create systems that are hierarchical by nature, right? Because then you have like these support structures. Also, by scaling up, you potentially lose relationship because at some point it becomes about building the big thing and not the actual relationships of people. Is that fair?
Yeah. And I think there's also a realization that you're not changing the infrastructure that created the problem in the first place. You're actually just feeding into it. You're replicating the same tools, the same patterns.
Yeah, I think that's right. The whole idea that we're by engaging in that mentality, we're feeding that we're operating within the monster and not calling into account the monster's own internal logic of domination, all these other things. So I was thinking about this in terms of at one point in the last episode, we were talking about Christian evangelization and proselytizing efforts. And I believe, Jason, you used a term that I feel like could fit in a D&D campaign, soul harvesting, right? That, Christians, evangelicals engaging in soul harvesting, because you have to collect more souls in order to make the thing bigger and bigger and bigger. And I'm not necessarily here to object to the idea of Christians thinking, I mean, I'm sure that's going to be a whole other conversation. I'm not here to necessarily call into question Christian soteriology in terms of like how the idea of salvation through Jesus. But there is a way that I think, particularly the way U.S. Christians operate, they operate with this sort of scaling up profit making mentality towards it, which I think, someone could argue, well, maybe that's not something inherent to Christianity. Maybe that's something where Christianity is being affected by capitalism. And I'd sort of have to say maybe a little bit yes and a little bit no. Christianity precedes capitalism, right? So it's not that Christianity hasn't operated outside of a capitalist framework, but there's also ways that modern evangelicalism in particular operates very much in capitalism, possibly because it's its native language. And so I've prepared some thoughts on that, but I want to open it up to you fellas if you have any comments on that point before moving into some of my thoughts here, which will involve talking about Max Weber and other people.
I think I would just add in there's a couple things that show up that we could touch on too, and that can be kind of the historical idea of the selling of forgiveness. Stepping into that kind of soul harvesting is like you can start in a good place, good process, but if your framing is wrapped into that scale, wrapped into that growth mentality, wrapped into even the more, that more is the core fiber of capitalism. So the literal sell of forgiveness, that's part of the narrative also can become victim and trapped to that. And also kind of the seed faith idea of kind of giving more donations is actually an act that will yield a larger return later, whether that's financially or spiritual. I think that also co-ops thinking in that if it's wrapped in that scale or in that growth mentality. So just adding those two kind of elements on there, so as we dig deep, we can.
Well, and you mentioned co-option, and that's an interesting point, and maybe we'll return to that later, because it's interesting, this idea, like, okay, giving charitably or not even charity, just giving to a cause you think is worthy, that could be a good thing. and then it gets co-opted for terrible purposes. I think anyone who wrestles with texts for a living, as like a philosopher or theologian does, or the interested layperson, kind of sees within any text or like philosophy or whatever, like on the one hand, there's emancipatory potential, but then likewise, there can also be oppressive potential in terms of how, because these things end up being almost, they're kind of ambiguous. They can be taken in ways that express more liberatory ways of looking at the world. And then they can be taken in ways that end up oppressing others. One thing I was thinking about regarding the whole like profit motive and how modern Christianity operates, I sort of was laying out a few ideas here. One was this idea of soul harvesting, how particularly there's a almost McDonald'sification of how Christianity operates in its attempt to gain converts, particularly in modern evangelicalism, from everywhere from, the Great Awakenings in the US, evangelicalism as it's practiced in Britain and the US. But then as we move into the 20th century with new media technologies, and then you have like, Billy Graham and people like that doing these massive crusades where so much of it is about the number of people who come up and claim to convert. And there's, again, I call it this McDonald'sification. And I realize some people found genuine faith through those moments, and that's fine. But the mentality is sort of like the bigger, the better, the like how many can we get, right, through this event? Like there's this, it's almost like looking at profit margins, right? In terms of like bigger, better, more, right? The more. So I was thinking about that idea of soul harvesting. I was thinking about church growth strategies that you see in the 20th century. I think C. Peter Wagner is one of the big figures there, and how those church growth strategies were all about growing the numbers. It's the more, even if the depth of spirituality isn't that deep. And how even part of that goal in scaling up in growth, like when you read some of these books, they're very explicit. Like it's easier to grow when you have a homogenous population. So like already there is this built-in, maybe not intentional racism, like the goal isn't racial oppression, but it nevertheless builds in this sort of default segregation because the model itself relies on a homogenous population in terms of race, in terms of class, right? And so I was thinking about that, like, and in my head, I'm like, of course, only in America, right? That's a very American model that's scaling up, that how profit motive gets turned into, well, we need more and more and more, even if there's that lack of depth and of real relationship and all those things. So I was looking at that, and yeah, Jason.
I was going to say, it's just, I want to kind of lean on or push back on that. That's unique to American Christianity because, the examples you gave is the 20th century, but we can go back to the 15th century of the doctrine of discovery. We can go back to colonization and missionary work even before the doctrine of discovery was a thing, and look at how that same model that you talked about in the 20th century of Christians looking at growth. If we Christianize or have a homogenized population, how easy it is to do this, and that was the core of missionary work and colonization that worked hand in hand during campaigns of resource extraction, economic slavery, and then the doctrine of discovery that just the divine right to conquer lands and people. I think the 20th century version of that, the 15th century and previous, gave permission to that. So I don't know if it's unique. I think it is unique, or not unique. I think it's a common thread around the growth mentality, the capitalist mindset, that it's about the accumulation of wealth and power, regardless of the umbrella that it sits under. In this case, it's Christianity.
Well, and there's a lot of things growing up together in that moment too, as the modern era begins and capitalism. The relationship between capitalism and imperialism and colonialism. The way that, as you point out, like we're extracting land from the African continent. We're extracting resources from the African continent, for example, and at the same time, missionaries are going in and Christianizing. And some of them, I think, eventually come to the point where they're criticizing colonialism. But there is this sense of like, the colonialism is fine as long as we're saving souls and growing soul converts, right? So it's the material profit motive, and then there's this soul harvesting profit motive that also ignores the deeper problems of relationality, of mutuality, since the colonizer is already in a place of moral supremacy in the mind, you know what I mean? They're in the place of supremacy compared to the person getting colonized, right? So yeah, no, I think that's a really great point. And really, I do know, obviously the Catholic Church is involved in the early colonization of the Americas. I do think it's interesting the way that I do think it becomes easier in Protestant circles to continue to reinforce that exploitation because, in the history of discussions of capitalism, and in a lot of ways, you don't get capitalism without the Protestant Reformation. And so this is where I would go to Max Weber. So think about that profit motive in Christianity. It's not that the Catholic Church has not been interested in profit motive. You talked about the sale of indulgences. We could talk about sort of the way Catholicism played a role in condoning the colonization, again, of Central and South America. Even as you did have people like Bartolome de las Casas and I think it's Vittoria talking about the need to respect the human rights of indigenous peoples, against the overwhelming force of, the Portuguese and the Spanish, and of course the Pope sort of, blessing some of those endeavors. But with Protestantism, there is that sense in which almost the McDonaldization of Christian motives and action gets put into place. So like, if you look at someone like Marx, Marx is going to argue that something like Protestant Christianity emerges out of capitalism to then reinforce and condone capitalism. Because really what mattered was, capitalism is the baseline. Capitalism gives birth to different legal and religious forms. And Max Weber turns that on its head. Max Weber says that without the Protestant Reformation, you don't get capitalism, because with capitalism, with Protestantism, a few things change. One, you now have the equality of all before God. You have the idea that it isn't just sacred vocations that are special, but secular vocations are special. So now everyone is doing their work for God and being productive. You throw in Calvin, who's arguing, and Calvin and his followers who argue that one of the ways to make sure and to confirm that God has elected you as one of his chosen is to work hard to show your election, and then to save and invest that money and be thrifty. And this is an interesting change in terms of how wealth is talked about, because it's not like the pre-Protestant Catholic world lacks corruption or anything, but there is a different status for wealth and growth that is given by Protestantism. Like if you go back far enough, I included a few quotes. I was talking to a friend recently about, Basil the Great has writing called On Social Justice, which I'm picking up. But Basil has this really great quote. Such are the rich. They seize what belongs to all and claim the right of possession to monopolize it. If everyone took for oneself enough to meet one's own wants and gave up the rest to those who needed it, there would be no rich, no poor. Or I really like a John Chrysostom quote, that what the rich possess belongs to the poor. Kind of the idea that like the rich should just take what they need, and it's like, whatever surplus they have beyond their own need belongs to the poor. So even when they receive inheritance from their parents or come in for some money, whatever the source, that surplus beyond their need belongs to the poor. So there is this sense and this condemnation of a growth mentality in Catholicism in many ways, to the point where you see, if you go to, I remember going to this on the study trip to Turkey, and there were these mosaics in some of these old churches, and what you see are the rich portrayed as children because it was a sign that they had a lesser place in the kingdom of God. And so you see these earlier Christian writers condemning growth mentality and wealth pursuit as, people are still doing it, obviously, but there's the explicit teaching of like, no, this is not morally worthy. And Protestantism changes that. Now wealth pursuit is morally worthy, and that gets Christianized, it's already Christian, but like it gets spiritualized too, where getting more souls shows that a church is profitable, right? Along with the pursuit of money. So when Moki, when you brought up that issue of Christians as like evangelical Christianity as this profit-seeking motive, I thought that was interesting, because in some ways it's built into the type of Christianity that's popular in our context. like stemming from the Protestant Reformation all the way up through everything from missionary endeavors to modern church growth strategies. And yet it's so against what we find in early Christian writers and even in the New Testament and even the prophets in the Hebrew Bible of like, woe to you who add house to house, field to field. Woe to you who are rich. Blessed are you if you're poor. Some of you don't get, the epistle of James is, some of you are basically trying to suck up to the rich, and aren't they the ones causing you problems? So yeah, I thought that kind of like doing a little genealogy there to sort of show how the very idea of growth and wealth has changed is it's sort of built into the DNA of particularly any type of Christianity that can trace itself to the Reformation.
Well, I'm just happy that the current Christian nationalism in the U.S. today have broken away from that.
Me
Yeah.
too.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's great. All Christian television, right? It's interesting too, the language, we could talk about I know some people are going to listen and say, what's so wrong? Like if people believe they're saving people from hell, like shouldn't you get people saved? And I'm going to put that soteriology question to the side. And I sometimes sort of wonder, like, what are you getting saved to, right? Like, what is the quality of relationship that this profit-seeking mentality like the church growth strategy where you're seeking a homogenous population to grow a church, like, it's using this like wrong means for good at like, it's almost like saving people's souls is worth maybe lack of spiritual depth, lack of relational depth. Oppression is almost basically okay as long as people are saved if you look at the history of colonialism, right? Having a colonialist attitude towards the people you're going to save is okay as long as they're getting saved. Like I remember visiting missionaries in continental Africa, and it was interesting to hear them. When you start to have this realization of what if the good guys I was supporting were the bad guys all along? And I remember they were complaining about white farmers having their farms taken from them in like Zimbabwe and other countries. And Zimbabwe has like Mugabe is corrupt. Like, there are these problems, but
in South Africa too.
In South Africa, yeah, the historic support of Americans of apartheid, how sort of the attempt to like any taking away of privileges by the white minority to give to the black majority are stood against by some maybe missionary elements or whatever, which sort of shows this colonial mentality. It's like, yes, you might be saving souls, but you think you're talking to a backward people here. And I think that that's really problematic. And I trace it back to the Protestant Reformation again. Luther is basically like, if people let you preach the gospel, basically any oppression is okay, right? If they're giving you permission to preach the gospel, then any oppression is okay. Because so much of what the gospel means is reduced to salvation by grace through faith. And any type of liberating community that should be formed or liberating attitude towards other people is seen as secondary. So, yeah, people are being saved, but what are they being saved into, right? Like if all we're talking about is, yes, I mean, because they did this with the slaves too. It's like, yeah, we're preaching the gospel and they're saved, but we don't need to upend social norms here, right? Like what mattered, in fact, it was good that they were enslaved because now they heard the gospel, right? Like,
but and even to press that point, because because someone can say, well, we're preaching, we're doing this to save their souls. There's the different versions of the slave Bible, where slave masters take out large sections of even whole books on the Bible that would, first of all, they wouldn't even allow the slaves to learn how to read on first hand. But then in the event that they do, any books in the Bible or any passages in the Bible that would incline them to even get a sense that perhaps it's not just spiritual salvation that I need, but I also want to be liberated from being a slave. And they take it out crazy. Is like I learned about this in seminary. So I was 20, like in my almost 30 when I learned about this. And was a very clear Christian example, essentially proving the obvious, that this is not just about souls. It's not just about spirit, like salvation or like advancing the gospel. Like it is a clear program to oppression. And, Matt, as you were talking even about soul harvesting and even how it plays out, kind of with the, I don't know if you called them seeker sensitive churches back, that's the term that that I grew up with. I just remembered the Prayer of Jabez, how that became this very popular prayer that you would. Jason, there's this story in the Bible where this guy prays to God for to be blessed, and one key phrase, which now thinking about it, I haven't thought about this for so long, but even in the context of this conversation, the prayer is, hold on, let me see if I can find it. Is he says, "Oh Lord, that you would bless me and enlarge my territory." And I mean, that just is clearly that, at least in the context of how it was applied in the Protestant, just like evangelical framework, that it just became influential. It was a a very strong connection between like God blessing you and you essentially becoming wealthier. It's a 100% material thing. And so and also what's interesting too, Matt, when you were saying earlier talking about church growth, it's very much like I heard this guy say once, like, you don't hate rich people. You hate rich people until you become rich. I think that's basically what it, like, there's a, no one will ever say it out loud, but everyone is essentially banking on being faithful to God will lead me to become wealthy. It will change my socioeconomic status so then I can tell other people not how to be obedient to God, but how to become wealthy. And this is basically Joel Osteen. But anyways, carry on.
Yeah. Jason, we said a lot. I don't know if you have any interjections. I was going to
Well,
comment. Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's just, I don't want us to get trapped, or even the listener to get trapped, or like, oh, this is all historical and I want to bring it to the present, but I want to start with the historical. I think you mentioned, Matt, that this began with a Protestant, kind of the theological reframing of labor. I think that played a part in it. I think it became a moment in time that we can point at and say, like, well, this is when the peasants started having theology attached to their labor, that work became something that brought you closer to God. I think that narrative goes back further, even further than that. I think the Protestant work ethic is a good example of what was building throughout generations before that. And so, speaking of generations building to it, nothing has changed even today, because conversations that we're having, looking at what's happening within the current administration, Christian nationalism and the GOP donor class are still playing the same narrative. They're still using churches as voter mobilization to create infrastructure that is aligned with policies that serve the rich, not the masses, not the poor, not anything that the lower class would think is what's valuable, what the teachings of God, the Bible, church is about. It's this rhythm that we were seeing from the 15th century to the 20th century to, all of this that we're talking about is still continuing today. And it's even more so in control of power and wealth than any time in history. I mean, that's obvious because it's part of that evolution of thought and entrenchment. But I think not a lot of people think about that. I think slavery, I think economic exploitation, control of power and resources has always been the game within this brand of growth mentality, Christianity, religious bindings. So I just want to pull that thread.
I think that's right. I was thinking about how much we thin out and flatten what prosperity means for a Christian, what it means to live a good Christian life means. Like, oftentimes when we talk about, how are we doing economically? Well, just look at how the market's doing. If the market's good, everything's good. And yet there's a lack of depth there, because underneath the surface, wages are not growing. The poverty level has not been raised since the middle of the 20th century. So, like, half the people are actually in poverty if you take into account per capita growth. And the same way, churches will look at the profit of maybe growth of members, the sort of mega church model of more is better. But the depth of relationship, the quality of relationship, even realities like, if you're going to have a church that represents an image of what the New Testament talks about, like, do you have a church of diverse class, race, ethnicity, all these things? And if your very model is, well, we've had very good growth because we just focused on white people, because homogenous groups, we have our niche market. Like, okay, you maybe are able to claim you've saved a bunch of souls, but you're not actually modeling anything worthy of following here. You're not actually creating, I do think that if you're going to model what the church is supposed to be, like, you at least need to, multi-ethnicity, multiculturalness needs to be part of it. And if you're not doing that, like if your model depends on not doing that, then something gross is happening, right? And
Well,
it does take work to do multicultural, multi-ethnic work in churches, but like that's just an example of how like our profit motive idea of what it means to do Christianity and create converts sort of seeps in, and it creates this two-dimensional version of what it means to be a Christian at the expense of being able to model something that is truly beautiful and liberating and emancipatory, because all those things are seen as second. Like pursuing, falling into systems of oppression is fine if souls are being saved. Then you don't need to call into, and that's probably because like Americans are just pragmatic. It's like it's working. It might not be the best, but at least this final end is being met. Jason, you talked about the Christian nationalists. I find it interesting how much, especially the circle around Trump, is that you have a lot of these like TBN prosperity preacher types, right, who are sort of playing into it and bringing their followers and condoning his action. And it just makes me think of what a friend of mine said one time, that, liberation theology, which talks about a preferential option for the poor and really challenging unjust structures. Liberation theology advocated for the poor, but the poor chose the prosperity gospel, right? Like somehow these promises of being set free in Jesus also got tied to giving towards these ministries that if you gave to them, you'd be blessed, you'd be set free, right?
But that's controlling the divine.
Controlling the divine. I think it's also an interesting way of co-opting language and changing language. Like, what does it mean to be set free, right? To prosper, to do well. And I sometimes think about this when I think about like Calvinist people I know. So like when I read the Bible, I read God as love. And I think there's a common sense way of talking about love is hoping for the well-being and flourishing of another person, of a community, of people around you, of the environment. That's something I'm getting from Tom Ward. That's his big deal here. But it's always interesting talking to, a lot of the evangelicals I was raised around, the type of evangelical I was, particularly Calvinists who, if you ask them what it means for God to be love, their definition will be something like, well, love is whatever God wants it to be, right? Which usually just means an expression of his own power, right? For his own glory. To the point where, if someone's preaching on the street, like let's take someone like Westboro Baptist who like use the F word toward gay people and all this other stuff, if you were to say, well, that's not really loving, it's like, some of them might argue, no, God actually hates you, but some of them might also argue that if someone is going to hell, it's more loving to preach to them that they're going to hell if you really thought that was true. But I do feel like that goes against our natural intuitions of what love is. Like it's co-opting what love is and changing it for some other purpose. Like I think, maybe you think preaching to others is important. Fine. But don't change what love means at the practical level of like recognizing the other as fully human, of caring about their flourishing in terms of their everyday well-being. And I feel like that's another example where love gets flattened out because it's appropriated to mean something it's not meant to mean.
Well, I think it's even goes deeper than that, because the most common phrase that you hear when talking, not to all Christian, but when you talk broad stroke, when you're talking to Christians, is the phrase love the sinner, not hate the sin. And that's co-optation of defining of love, because all that does is it's a soft blow to allowing exclusionism. It's a soft blow from continuing to condemn the person, but it's wrapped in a definition of love that is not a representation of love or unconditional love, or what we would think of when we ask a bystander without context of religion, what does love mean to you?
Yeah, I think that's right. And with the prosperity folks, they'll talk about someone being set free in their lives if they give. And it's like, okay, you're spiritually set free. But like, liberation theology would say, no, you actually need to be set free of the structures around us. And I find it interesting all the ways that emancipatory language gets co-opted, right? Like we've talked about how the language of love can get spiritually co-opted. The language of getting set free can be co-opted. Like Jason, I was talking to you a little bit beforehand. Like, I sometimes find it interesting how like reactionary movements, like anti-egalitarian movements or movements that go against like public goods and health and all these things will sort of say some of the same things that more liberatory movements will say, but there's like a hidden meaning. Like, for instance, like if I hear a right-wing person talk about why pharmaceutical companies are bad, like, as someone who leans more politically left, probably if you were to categorize me, I'd be like, yes, pharmaceutical companies are bad, but why? Right? Like, for them, it's because the medicine is bad. Right? For me, it's because of the economic exploitation involved and not allowing that medicine to be affordable. Like when, certain medicines are raised, at a way higher price than they need to be when people might need them to live, right? Like, yes, I also am against pharmaceutical companies. I just feel like my view is more based in reality in a way that might be helpful to people versus this other way, right? Or language of racism and anti-racism. Like, it's amazing the number of people I'm seeing online who talk about how racist it was that there was an all-black district. Like, oh, so we're still making districts by race in Tennessee, which really is this bad faith taking of what should be emancipatory language, critiquing racism, to then use it against steps that are being used to deal with the historic realities of past racism, which end up producing racist results. So this language of co-option, where language that should be used to set people free is actually used in oppressive ways. Like, that's something I see. I mean, I see it in Christianity all the time, in part because, there is this sort of like prophet way of thinking about like, well, no, you're set free because you're in Jesus now, even if the ways you're living and the ways we structure what it means to be a Christian are themselves completely oppressive. Like, you're set free in Jesus. But for some areas, it's like, for some people, it's like you have to be a stay-at-home wife and mother now. You're not allowed to have a job or something.
And I think that's where the transition is, because you take spiritual language, you take liberation language that is to serve the whole, and you make it individual. You make it about yourself. So, like in the spiritual language, freedom in Christ, whatever, I forgot what language you just use. That at least in my interpretation, my understanding, that is a representation that now that you're with Christ, now that you are a Christian, you are free from sin. But where the co-op bridge happens is when that's collapsed in political, economic freedoms, that you are now free from regulation, taxes, you're free from all of these things. And then taking that into kind of taking that into that individual level, where we're make it about the person and make it about the individual, then that's where the slippery slope aspect of it comes in, where you can start then controlling the narrative of the divine and setting these stages up so people will take the free from sin to no longer have that meaning, and it'd be about self-salvation, self-growth, benefit, because I believe in God. When there's, at least in my opinion, there was never any promise of that when you become free from sin.
Yeah. I think about Martin Luther and how, going back to what Luther says, like, again, Luther, and this might affect Protestantism more than anything. On the whole, at least Catholics in some ways have a language for this, with like Catholic social teaching and Vatican II and some of these other things that, like, liberation theology starts in Catholicism, right? There's a language for it, in part because I think Catholics take the words of Jesus in the gospel seriously, like the ones where it's like, woe to you who are rich. Like, even if there's hypocrisy, it's at least wrestled with. Whereas Luther basically goes, that stuff's just there to tell you how sinful you are and you'll never match up. So really, it's just you're saved by grace through faith. And that can mean you can live in the most oppressive environment you have to. And as long as you can just preach grace through faith, it doesn't matter. Right? It doesn't matter. There's no greater liberation to be had. And so there's never that critique of structures, because in some ways there's no hope for changing those structures. And
I think there's critique of structure. I think there's a different intention behind the critique of the structure. It's again goes back to that self-serving mechanism. I mean, because you think about servant leadership, you constantly hear about Jesus washing the feet. And I also see that being also co-opted, that it's justified to extract more labor, that it flattens authority as humility, and then that's used to then progress more. I mean, it's more than just one thing, but it's used to open the door to the next step that justifies exploitation, it justifies giving, justifies mega churches, justify all of this.
Yeah, servant leadership is great when followers do it, right?
Mhm.
Like I'm thinking about at around, I forget if it was the downturn in like 2006 or 2007 or sometime before that. Maybe it was the downturn that happened right after 9/11 when we went through a recession around that time. But I remember going to the Willow Creek Leadership Summit, which was this big seeker-sensitive church in Chicago. And I remember the big thing they were pushing that year was the volunteer revolution, because they had to fire a bunch of people who worked at the church because they had a budget shortfall. And so they pushed this volunteer revolution, which is basically free labor, right? And just how, now the more I read about labor rights, the more I'm like, maybe you should only grow as much as you can pay people to actually do the work. And I know that there is a
But the
place
Good
for
Samaritan, Matt, come on.
well, and I think there is a place for charitable. I do think there is a place for volunteering time. I'll just say that volunteering time. I think there's a place for that. I do think I do think there is an exploitation that comes of people who are very passionate about stuff. I think as someone who was trying to be in ministry myself and thinking about how friends I had who volunteered at churches where they eventually got hired, just like it's like they were basically working a full-time job and volunteering at a full-time amount. And it's like by volunteering at that full-time amount, they got noticed, showed that they could be faithful, whatever. And then like, I think there's something weird about that. Like there's something not okay with that. Or I remember being it was either in a seminary class or maybe in Bible college. We were watching this video about this West Coast revival prayer movement. And it was interesting things they talked about. Say, yeah, we were praying for moral revival. We were praying for this. We were praying against a labor movement strike that was happening. And I was like, wait, what was that last part? wait, let's go back to that. Right? Like the and it's not that there have been no like Christian people involved in labor movements or in civil rights movements or in women's rights movements. But I just found it weird, like the antipathy towards labor movements and labor rights that has at times peeked through in certain Christian writings. And it's not, let's set everyone free, except in their labor conditions where they might lose a hand in a factory machine. Like, but yeah, no, I think that's a good point. The way servant leadership is used towards followers. And what's interesting, towards followers and what become inherently hierarchical organizations, right? Like I'm thinking about how many of these TV preachers are just like the sole authority in the churches they have or in the ministries that they have. The way authority is viewed by, I can certainly think of churches I'm in where it's like, no, the pastor is the anointed man of God. And like your role is to serve his vision, right? And how that higher, and people who would talk about how the United States Constitution granted us freedom of conscience and all this stuff, but there was still this hierarchical element in. There was this prosperity gospel-y element in. There was some colonialism mixed in there about, helping others and telling them what they need, right? Maybe not always like doing what they could to approach as equals in a scenario, right? Yeah, just how anti-egalitarian it was, how exploitative it was.
I think that's justified because of the chosen people mentality that is also kind of translated into the current Christian national exceptionalism, is that, people who are freed from kind of empire or oppressive conditions, which are not even true today, or are still absorbed within the Christian nationalist mindset, that they are being persecuted. So therefore, because they can't do everything that they want to do, that's oppressive.
Yeah. And what's funny about that is I've sometimes thought about this with the persecution mentality by people who basically are running everything in the country. A lot of it's just, you just don't want to share with other people. You know what I mean? Like, you just don't want to share the space with other people. Moki, you've been awfully quiet. I was going to make a joke like, Moki, why are we Christians again? No,
really.
Well,
you don't actually have to answer that question I just asked.
What was the question? What was the question? What was it?
Oh no, I was
why
just
we
saying,
Christians again?
You've been awfully
What's
quiet
wrong with you
during
two
this
is the question.
conversation.
No, I'm just kidding.
Right. I've been thinking a lot, and it's I think there's, for the most part, conservative Christian, like, or evangelical ideology. I mean, this notion of being a chosen people is a very, like, you can't be a Christian if you don't believe that at some level. But there's a way in which, like, it gets it's viewed mainly through this lens of prosperity that is supposed to mean like some material or socioeconomic, like change and like upward mobility. But one thing I was thinking about as you're talking, even with churches, is the one of the big, I think for me, one of the big things that like just is needed is this idea of being a member of a church. And I remember, when I was in high school, I would, God, like, what is God's calling on my life? And it's people were asking Loki, like, do you think you want to, go into ministry and none of that? And I was like, this is back in high school. I just remember thinking, like, there's no way that I want my life to be like my livelihood to be based on the number of people that are in my church, because they're basically the ones who are going to pay me. And that's what I, for the most part, seen church membership in like the evangelical world that I've lived in, is that part of it is this idea of soul harvesting, but the other one is also like paying my bills. All the pastors that many pastors that I was, a part of the churches growing up, like, depending on how the church gave is how they paid their bills that month. So for me, I always looked at it as like this thing that there was it mattered for like spiritually, but then also the setup is one where it was not honest about how like that is used for. You're basically, church members are your essentially like your bank account. The model of membership is a very like big aspect that allows for this. I'm not saying it happens all the time, but it does make it easier to have like a baked in hierarchy where, for example, servant leadership as an example, it's it's good for you to, give your labor for free as long as you're not the pastor. Like, it makes it easier to do that because essentially, like, there's always one more thing you can tell them to do that will create a sense of angst for their like eternal salvation. And the membership model makes it like a lot easier for that to occur. And I've just been thinking a lot about like my own upbringing, about seeing Benny Hinn on TV, and Hard Bonky when I was growing up in Kenya was like the main guy. But also, one thing that I really did that was funny to me, anyways, when you were talking about seeker sensitive and kind of these like just the cult of personality with these televangelists, I was thinking about Tony Robbins and his conferences and everything. It's like basically like televangelists were essentially like the Christian version of Tony Robbins. You take away the message and you just like put up what was going on. It's literally the same thing. It took a long time for me to uh like see how dishonest a lot of the motives for the Christian teaching and lack thereof that I got growing up was. That as much as it was about saving souls, it very much was about upward mobility for you, even if it's at the expense of other people. Because if you're moving up, then God is blessing you. And it's okay if you're the only one who's getting blessed, because that means that at least you're going to heaven. So
Yeah, you brought back a lot of memories in terms of evangelist. When I was a kid, my favorite person to watch on TV, just because it was not because of what he said or who he was or whatever, but just the absurdity of it, was Gene Scott. Because he would just sit there with a cigar in his chair on stage. This was, televised. It would be on TV. He would sit on the stage in a chair with a cigar and say, "I'm not going to tell you the gospel until we reach this amount of money." And he would just sit there and smoke his cigar until that hit. And then when it would hit, he would step up,
that is hilarious.
give a little of the gospel, then stop. Say, "I'm not going to continue until we hit this." And I was just
never
so
heard of this
fascinated by that.
I have never heard of this person, but like,
Man, let me put it in the chat then. Let me see if I can find it.
Oh my God, this is
Gene Scott is just amazing, but amazing in the most horrible way. But
I need a new career.
yeah, I know, man.
brought back memories of Gene Scott when you were talking, so I just want to share that. But
Yeah.
what the point that I wanted to make is that
it's getting crazy.
any institution can be co-opted this way, and we can look at when we look at Christianity and the historical evolutionary thread of Christianity, we can pull that thread of like the evolution of individualism, capitalism, and how it's manifested over the year. And I think for us not to get in the trap of that, we're constantly naming, oh, this is bad, this is bad, this is where it got co-opted. I think the lesson that we should elevate, maybe talk about a little bit, is how do you identify when it's happening in real time? So if it actually goes against your values, and you really need to check into your values to make sure that hasn't been co-opted because the veil of controlling the divine. Reconnect with that, and then how can you tell in real time when this is actually happening? And then how do you actually restructure if you still choose to believe in the church and in Christ? How do you recognize when it's happening, and then what do you do to actually start shifting that to go a different direction? Because we talk about Moki, you said, because I kept naming the Christian nationalists, but it's also Christian conservatives, it's a Christian right, it's that whole spectrum. But what we're not talking about is the Christian left. And as an anarchist, I hate the division between the left and the right and the center, because it's all within that same system.
But
I'm going to forgive that in my narrative for the moment, for the sake of this point, is that there is a bucket of people who are saying we need to be anti-capitalist, we need to be anti-racist, we need to be anti-individualist when it comes to the Word of God, the church, or whatever. So there are, and I think Matt, y'all both talked about that and sharing your personal stories about researching and looking into other pathways. So I'm bringing that back in just because it's easy and it's sometimes fun for us to cherry pick, and it's not really cherry picking in this case, but pick examples of the legacy of how Christianity has been mainly about growth, exploitation, and individual benefit. But it's not the full narrative is not just that. That is just the mainstream narrative. So maybe we can talk about like, well, how do you what happens in the moment that you recognize that you're being co-opted, that the message or values and stuff is actually being derailed in the sake of personal gain, and what do you do about it? Or is that the next episode?
That's a great question. Definitely, I mean, the Christian right definitely has many problems. Probably should start calling it the Christian wrong, but it's everywhere. And I think part of, for me, like with like on the left side, I guess, I think there's a sense of like moral superiority in some ways, in that like we're not the Christian, at least we're not conservative, or even like oh look, I'm protesting today. So it's just taking the same stuff from one side, paint it different color, and then put it up as but it's the same shit. But that could be a conversation for another day.
Yeah, I do think this could be carried on another time, but I'll say briefly in terms of, how would I avoid being co-opted? I actually felt myself struggling with this in the 2024 election. And since then, how, at the time, I sort of, in 2024, I sort of embraced my inner Reinhold Niebuhr being like, okay, lesser of two evils. And I talked about this on a previous podcast. I have had to catch myself. I had to catch myself with Biden on this, and I had to catch myself at other times of like, it was very easy after voting for Biden to start to rubber stamp. Like, what? To do the same thing I was accusing others doing. Well, I can't criticize him because then, if you criticize him too much, he might lose power, and then the other guy might get in, right? Like, to remain open in good faith critique, even if there is someone I'm supporting just because I think they're the lesser of two evils. I think about what Cornel West said, like when he talks about, working with political groups. It's like you try to find someone who you can, who you think you'll be able to work with best to further the goals you're pursuing. But like, you've got to keep both eyes open. Like you can't rubber stamp. You can't become a company man, a party guy. So for me, just briefly thinking about a time recently where I kind of felt myself struggling with that and having to sort of check myself and being like, I don't just want to go from having been a Christian right supporter to a Christian left supporter. And I realized I don't think those two positions are morally equivalent. Like, I think there are real problems. Like, I don't think Biden is equivalent to Trump. Like, I really thought that like Biden was, at least he did a better job of supporting comparatively in a U.S. situation like labor, right? And working folks. But like, that didn't change what I felt was like a kind of, he still was giving Israel permission to like basically carpet bomb Palestinian civilians. Like when you look at the death rates, it's like for every one Hamas guy, 4 civilians were killed or whatever, right? Like the human shield thing doesn't work for me there. Like there was real loss of life happening and real, violence that was very unrestrained in response to October 7th that I didn't think was appropriate. And that's where it's like, no, you have to keep eyes open there. Like we need, like without also being a both sideser. Like you can't both sides this shit either, because then you end up making moral equivocations between positions that are not morally equivocable. So I'm not sure if I have a guideline, but I've tried to live by that even as I've become more politically engaged, live by West's idea there of like keeping both eyes open, not becoming a company man here. Even as I am imperfectly engaged with stuff. The other thing too is being surrounded by friends who can maybe hold me a little bit to account. Like I don't think I've surrounded myself with people who are just going to be, reaffirm all of my own intuitions. So that I think is also helpful for me. But I think that whole thing of being co-opted is a very real problem. And it's something like I said, I have some like plumb lines I go by. I think having a suspicion of anyone in power is also another good way. Like even if it's someone who you supported, like be suspicious of power. Like power changes people. Like studies have been done about this. Like having greater power changes your brain in some ways, like a Phineas Gage style brain injury. The guy who had the railroad spike go through his eye.
I think just to add it for a future conversation, I think it's interesting that when we talked about, or at least my framing of how I was defining Christian left and how you defined Christian left was quite different, because you went Biden and we're not even thinking. I was like, that's
right.
It's the same thing. I was thinking more of the Christian left in terms of what we see historically in the 60s and 70s in Peru, Chile, Argentina, Brazil. That Christian where it was actually historically rooted in anti-imperialist political actions or political movements, anti-capitalist political movements and anti-poverty political movements. That is how I would have defined the Christian left in that framing. So I think I just find it fascinating that even within that, there's just so much to explore, because Biden I would not have put him in the Christian left category.
Right. I was thinking Christian left, like, oh, Christians who also vote for Democrats, like,
Yeah.
like some of the like surgeon people or whatever, who I know themselves were frustrated with Biden, but like, it's like, that's an interesting, like, what do we even mean by Christian left? Is it just people who won't vote Republican, right?
And there's something unique about that. When we say Christian right, I think there's a shared understanding already. But when we say Christian left, because that conversation doesn't happen much, there was such a disconnect already. But when we say Christian right, we're on the same page because that's been the predominant narrative.
Well, isn't that a problem with the left in general? Like the left has basically been fractured since the 70s.
Yeah.
I am going to push back on your definition of the left again.
See, and this is why this is the problem. All right, friends, we are at the 1:15 mark. I think obviously of course, we have many places we could go now, but now we've reached the end. So if you have enjoyed this podcast, do feel free to like, subscribe. You can send us an email at onequestionpodcast1q@gmail.com. Leave comments. If you have questions, we would love to address them here on the show. So do feel free to do that. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time.
See ya.
Peace.